Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at Jacques Derrida's book, Dissemination. This book consists of 4 essays of Derrida's, and we're going to be looking at 3 of them. The first is titled Outwork and regards the idea of the preface. He's going to be looking at Hegel's preface to the phenomenology of spirit, especially, and discussing the sort of impossibility laden within the preface itself, and put forth a theory of writing where all writing is preface, really. It's always an attempt to start something which has already started and disseminated beyond the terms which supposedly would be restricted and explicated logically in a preface. Then in Plato's Pharmacy, he looks at the idea of the pharmakon in the work of Plato, and this idea of pharmakia, which he's going to look at all of the multifarious meanings that this Greek word has for medicine, but also for things like poison and magic, and discuss the relationship of these concepts to writing. And then finally, the title essay, Dissemination, where he really talks about this idea of what it means to disseminate. And he's looking at the work of Philippe Solers, who was a French writer, writing around and after Joyce, and who Derrida was very much influenced by and friends with. And in this lecture, I'm going to kind of be talking about some of the main concepts in this book, and we'll be looking at some of the passages that I will read and explicate so that you can get kind of a taste of what this book is like. It's definitely a very abstract book, lots of quotations, lots of meandering through very particular literary and philological problems, as well as various philosophical paradigms. And really central to here is Derrida's attempt to actually enact his philosophy of deconstruction. And we'll be starting this lecture in his preface where he actually talks about what deconstruction is, but I think it's very relevant to consider the way that Derrida really merges the gap, or the supposed gap, between philosophy and literature. He wants literature to always be sort of chasing its tail, but in the process, kind of birthing new terms and going on meandering, circuitous routes to deliver us often new reflections on very old works, such as the likes of Plato. In his preface on the outwork, he talks about the deconstruction of philosophy, which he sees as so central to his project. He sees all writing as beholden to the structure of the double mark, caught, both seized and entangled in a binary opposition, one of the terms retaining its old name so as to destroy the opposition to which it no longer quite belongs, to which in any event it has never quite yielded, to the history of this opposition being one of incessant struggles generative of hierarchical configurations. So he's really trying to see the history of philosophy as a creation of constant binarisms, one term of which is privileged over the other. And this structure of the double mark, which he's going to be elaborating, this duplicity of writing, this always already multipleness of writing, he sees as working the entire field within which these texts move. This structure itself is worked in turn. The rule according to which every concept necessarily receives 2 similar marks, a repetition without identity, one mark inside and the other outside the deconstructed system, should give rise to a double reading and a double writing, and, as will appear in due course, a double science. No concept, no name, no signifier can escape this structure. So what is he talking about here? This is already pretty dense. Well, Derrida is very keen to punctuate this idea that philosophy is always a result of systemic creations of concepts that it retroactively tries to cover up the history of. It establishes or creates binaries, and then it tries to forget about the history of them to make it seem as if they were simply self-evident, self-present marks of truth. And Derrida wants to deconstruct this. And not only does he want to do this in this sort of, facile kind of common sense notion of deconstruction that we have in common parlance, but he wants to do a very specific thing with deconstruction, where he wants to look at these hierarchical oppositions and he wants to invert them. And in so doing, he supplants the supposed truthfulness of these hierarchical oppositions. He's basically deconstructing the self-presence of the signifier of truth and the univocality of truth that is so central to Western philosophy. In its place, he wants to apply the name writing to that which critiques, deconstructs, wrenches apart the traditional hierarchical opposition between writing and speech, between writing and the idealist, spiritual, phonocentrist, first and foremost logocentric system of all of what is customarily opposed to writing. And here we have a lot of Derridian terms. Right? We've got this idea of phonocentrism and logocentrism. And logocentrism is going to be very important for us because Derrida sees the history of Western philosophy as dominated by the centrality of the logos, which supposedly speaks for itself and in fact speaks truth. So truth is associated with speech because speech is supposed to be something articulate, powerful, and forceful that speaks to a particular moment of truth. And think about creation narratives in the Epic of Gilgamesh or in the Bible in Genesis, where we have the speaking of the world into being. This creates a hierarchy between speech and writing, where speech is seen as more authentic, more conducive to truth. Think about when you make an oath and you have to speak the oath. Or think about an orator who speaks, and this is associated with authority. Think about speeches of famous leaders and the way that they carry a unique authority. The way that we create whole sort of customs around the giving of speeches. And the way that writing is talked about, and he's going to talk about this when he talks about Plato in the Pharmacy, writing is often relegated to something that is merely a refuse for speech. It is merely a byway to preserve the authenticity of speech. And therefore, writing should ideally, in the history of Western philosophy, be reducible to or return us to speech. Speech supposedly being the authentic, authorizing moment of truth. But what Derrida wants to do is he actually wants to bring attention to the ambiguity of marks and point out how this is actually the condition of speech. Therefore, he wants to vie for a primacy of the written signifier and letter, which precedes spoken discourse. And he wants to talk about all the structural faculties that inhere in the practice of writing, in the institution of writing, in the techne of writing. And he wants to show that all of the capacities that it has, for example, dissemination, the key subject of this book, this is actually the foundation for the possibility to speak unique utterances. And in fact, utterances efface themselves as soon as they've been spoken, right? As soon as you speak something, that singular speech moment has passed. And we have institutions to try to buttress that moment, to try to give it some legitimacy and to try to give it some permanence. But really, Derrida is really interested in this idea of the way written marks or written signifiers have a permanency which effaces any univocality, any singularity of one act, and actually brings forth and disseminates a series of historical and temporal deferrals of meaning, whereby meaning is postponed, and in that very project, it is delivered to the future right? It is iterated. So he's really interested in the iterability of marks, in the iterability of the signifier that we see in writing, which for him has the capacity within it, which he wants to make explicit, to critique, deconstruct, and wrench apart these hierarchical oppositions between writing and speech, such that writing should no longer be able to assume any reassuring form, neither that of a referent, at least if conceived as a real thing or cause anterior and exterior to the system of general textuality, nor that of presence in any of its modes, meaning, essence, existence, whether objective or subjective in form, nor that of a fundamental or totalizing principle, nor even of a last instance. In short, the classical system's outside can no longer take the form of the sort of extra text which would arrest the concatenation of writing, i.e., that movement which situates every signified as a differential trace, and for which I had proposed the concept of transcendental signified. Différence also designated, within the same problematic field, that kind of economy, that war economy, which brings the radical otherness, or the absolute exteriority of the outside, into relation with the closed, agonistic, hierarchical field of philosophical oppositions, of differens or différence. An economic movement of the trace that implies both its mark and its erasure, the margin of its impossibility, according to a relation that no speculative dialectic of the same and the other can master, for the simple reason that such a dialectic always remains an operation of mastery. So what is he doing here? We've got another very heady paragraph, and there will be many more to come, but we're gonna really piece these apart. Well, what he's saying is that writing doesn't in fact depend upon referentiality. So the realist assumption, you look at realists like Dickens, for example. The idea is that writing has truth because it refers to a referent in the world, or at least possibly could refer to a referent in the world. And philosophers are beholden to this same notion of truth, that truth has something to do with the way that language and concepts map onto and refer to the world. So there's this idea of the internality of philosophical systems and the outside that they supposedly refer to. But Derrida says this is in fact not the case. They don't need to have some real thing or cause anterior or exterior to the system of textuality, right? Something independent of the text. Because Derrida is coming from the structuralist tradition, and he is a post-structuralist for many reasons, but one of the things that he's indebted to, of course, is Saussure's idea of texts consisting of a series of differential marks, or differential traces, as Derrida calls them, where signifiers have relation to each other, and that is what gives them meaning, is the fact that they relate to each other in different ways, and they form these webs of signifiers, and they just sprawl outwards in a given textual field. And a textual field could be anything. It could be a single sentence. It could be the oeuvre of an entire writer or of an entire tradition or school. But these textual fields are going to create relationships between their elements, just naturally, because, of course, writing has syntax, right? It has logical relations of its elements together and certain conventions for the way that you put signifiers together. Therefore, it need not have some empirical referent in the world in order to make sense. Sense is an interior phenomenon for the structuralists. But the reason that Derrida is a post-structuralist is he doesn't want to reduce the text to this absolute interiority, insofar as the structuralists are going to talk about how we can come to truth claims about the texts simply by looking at the structural relations between the signifiers. And if we could merely account for those relationships in their specificity, we could come up with the truth of the text. But what makes Derrida a post-structuralist is this opposition that really is effaced in his philosophy between the inside and the outside. The inside, the interiority or the supposed fixity of any textual field is in fact dependent upon a radical alterity that is the outside of the text, that which it cannot assimilate, and that which it tries to assimilate, tries to signify in its relations. But in so doing, it must truncate and it must change that difference. It must try to wrest it into some sort of structure of sameness. But Derrida wants to show how différance is one of the ways, and dissemination is really an aspect of différance, how différance is going to situate every signifier in a signifying field, where it depends upon the radical otherness or the absolute exteriority of the outside in an economy that implies both its own mark and the erasure of its own mark, right? It implies this idea that there are marks that we are looking at, but it also entails that they will never be enough on their own. We will always need more marks. And this accretion inherent in the idea of the signifier is really central for Derrida. We can see this in Derrida's oeuvre because he published so many books and essays and did so many debates and interviews. So this idea of the accretion of signifiers on top of one another, or of a chain of signification, as he and also Lacan will talk about it, this is the way that signifiers will defer their meaning to other signifiers without anyone actually being final. Such that, as he says, these oppositions have never constituted a given system, a sort of ahistorical, thoroughly homogeneous table, but rather a disymmetric, hierarchically ordered space whose closure is constantly being traversed by the forces and worked by the exteriority that it represses. That is, expels, and, which amounts to the same, internalizes as one of its moments. Right? So this is what happens when textual systems try to do that movement of wresting the outside that I talked about. Texts are never a given formal system. In fact, Derrida wants to show that marks are fundamentally non-formal. We try to systematize them into formal systems when we talk about, like the way that linguists talk about languages. They try to talk about it as a formal sequence of relations, and you can define each element in your language. And with etymology, you can trace the concrete history and development of signifiers. But all of this shows, especially when we look at something like etymology and we look at the historical development of signifiers, we see that fundamental ambiguity that prevents texts from ever being a given system, a homogeneous table. Instead, it is disymmetric, right? It creates a symmetry between two poles which depend upon each other. These are the duplicity of writing, both internal to the system and the duplicity of the signifier that constitutes an interior and an exterior beyond the signifier. These are two different aspects of duplicity, really a duplicitous duplicity, we might say, in which the writing space is always being traversed by forces that depend upon what the text is not, what the text is trying to talk about or trying to signify. And it claims that it is speaking to some moment which preceded it, when in fact it is trying to constitute that moment in the movement of différance. And différance is what he calls a productive, conflictual movement which cannot be preceded by any identity, any unity, or any original simplicity, which cannot be relieved, resolved, or appeased by any philosophical dialectic, and which disorganizes, historically, practically, textually, the opposition or the difference between opposing terms. Right, so every textual field is traced and traversed by différance, which is constantly deconstructing any unity, and texts are always trying to fight against this différance because it threatens the authority of any one narrative. And this is actually the force, the very radical, revolutionary force of deconstruction, is it looks at the givens in a text, and it tries to deconstruct what is supposed to be given, the metaphysical assumptions. And one of the metaphysical assumptions that he really wants to look at in this outwork is that which goes into a preface, and he looks at Hegel's preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. And what's really funny about this preface, and before he even was talking about Hegel, I was like, man, this really reminds me of Hegel's preface to the Phenomenology. Well, in that, Hegel basically starts off by talking about the impossibility of writing a preface. Because a preface is trying to introduce terms. But it's hard to introduce truth. It's hard to lead into truth, right? If truth is true, then it's hard to kind of slowly work your way into a philosophical treatise and introduce the principles without stumbling over the sort of circular impossibility of you already have to understand a little bit about these concepts and able to conceptualize them even in a preliminary way. So to write a preface, you do this impossible thing where you're trying to summarize or introduce concepts while at the same time realizing that your readers have yet to be introduced to those concepts. So you're trying to both initiate them into something which is at the same time esoteric and which is sort of sealed off, and it's hard to know any one way in, especially if you view your philosophical system as extremely robust, as filled in on all sides. It has no holes. Well, then how do you even get into it? Well, this is a problematic that Derrida discusses, and he says this about the preface. If the preface appears inadmissible today, it is on the contrary because no possible heading can any longer enable anticipation and recapitulation to meet and to merge with one another. To lose one's head, no longer to know where one's head is, such is perhaps the effect of dissemination. If it would be ludicrous today to attempt a preface that really was a preface, it is because we know semantic saturation to be impossible. In other words, right, a fully univocal semantic entity that is self-sufficient, that doesn't need further elaboration. The signifying precipitation introduces an excess facing that cannot be mastered. The semantic after effect cannot be turned back into a teleological anticipation and into the soothing order of the future perfect. The gap between the empty form and the fullness of meaning is structurally irremediable, and any formalism, as well as any thematicism, will be impotent to dominate that structure. They will miss it in their very attempt to master it. The generalization of the grammatical or the textual hinges on the disappearance, or rather the reinscription of the semantic horizon, even when, and especially when, it comprehends difference or plurality. In diverging from polysemy, comprising both more and less than the latter, dissemination interrupts the circulation that transforms into an origin what is actually an after effect of meaning. So Derrida is putting forth something very important here, and it gets to the very heart of what we mean by concepts and what we mean by meaning. He wants to say that meaning, especially the meaning of a text, does not precede the text. For indeed, if it is a meaning of a text, think about this word of. It is both about the text, but it is also of or from the text. It stems from some specific concatenation of signifiers that can only be understood by reading the text. So the truth of the text really has no value independent of the text. And in fact, the text is always sort of ripping itself apart from its own ambiguities, and we as readers, as we are reading it, are trying to construct a meaning. And if we come to any meaning, it is because we have found our head in the process of making it, because we have made meaning as an after effect of the meaning which the text claims authorizes that project in the first place. So what Derrida is doing damage to is this idea of the pre-existing truthfulness of a treatise which would be testified to in a preface. A preface is trying to secure this project of the pre-existing nature of the truth of the treatise. And the preface is somehow like an outside or a pretext, right? that it is somehow separate from the rest of the textual entity, and it speaks as a sort of outside. But in fact, Derrida says it is not an outside to the text. It is merely either a part of the text, if you want to view it as a whole published book, or it is just another text. It's just more texts, which are trying to speak to the authoritativeness of this text by supposedly hearkening to an outside, but it's not actually an outside. It is a reinscription of the semantic horizon that fails to comprehend difference or plurality. It diverges from polysemy, from the multiplicity of meanings, of the ambiguities that might be in the actual treatise itself. And it tries to sacrifice those. It might try to set up some sort of expectation on which you should be reading the work. It might set up some definitions. It might set up some preliminary remarks to make sense of some of the holes in the treatise. It might defer some sort of problem and say, hey, I'm going to focus on this in a future piece of writing, so don't worry about it right now. And really, this is just opening up another hole. This is adding difference to try to eliminate the difference and the ambiguity inherent in interpretation. As such, the preface is always writing its impossibility for Derrida. And this really gets to the heart of a very controversial phrase of Derrida's. Il n'y a pas hors texte. There is no outside text. This has often been incorrectly translated as there is no outside to the text, which is not what Derrida is saying. Derrida is not saying there is nothing but books. What he's saying is there is no hors text. This is a hyphened word. There is no outside text, which is to say a text which can wrest the outside, which can speak in a textual voice the authenticity of the outside as outside. What Derrida is saying is that writing is always condemned into its interiority, which it is always trying to defer, trying to deny, and trying to claim that it speaks to a uniquely authorized, uniquely real account. But in fact, Derrida really wants to temper what texts are doing. Really what they are doing is they are just disseminating more marks. They are making more texts. So in the heterogeneity of the development of texts, through one book, through an oeuvre, through a school, through a particular publication house, all that we are trying to do is disseminate marks. And what this means is that there is no unique author that would precede or exclude textualization. If we want to talk about truth and we want to formalize it into something, what do we have to do? We have to put it into language. We have to write it. Or we at least tacitly invoke the capacities of the signifier, which is writing for Derrida. And he gives this very helpful kind of explication of what he means by il n'y a pas hors texte. To allege that there is no absolute outside of the text is not to postulate some ideal immanence, the incessant reconstitution of writing's relation to itself, right? So it is not to posit some simply self-present world out there that would authorize the world. And it's also not postulating the immanence of a text which just speaks for itself. It's neither of these. What is in question is no longer an idealist or theological operation which, in a Hegelian manner, would suspend and sublate what is outside discourse, logos, the concept or the idea. The text affirms the outside, marks the limits of this speculative operation, deconstructs and reduces to the status of effects all the predicates through which speculation appropriates the outside. And this idea of speculation appropriating the outside, he's really, jabbing Hegel right here, because Hegel claims in his system to be able to account for, in logical, philosophical terms, history. To be able to account through a speculative philosophy how history will unfold, its specific dynamics and mechanics, and how it will account for difference in advance. And this is something that Derrida wants to deny, because really what Hegel does is he truncates difference into sameness, into the sameness of Geist or spirit. And Derrida wants to do the opposite. He wants to show how all unity dissimulates and disseminates itself. How it always tries to appropriate that which is invading and exploding it from the very inside. This is the outside. It is the Lacanian real that the text affirms precisely by marking its inability to mark that outside. Think of if you have some spiritual experience, or you have a crazy drug trip, or you go on a great vacation, and you try to write about this. Or even if you look at a pretty sky and you try to take a picture of it. This is a sort of analogous example. In all of these, you try to inscribe or duplicate. You try to repeat that which has a singular uniqueness to it, a unique reality to it, outside of schemas of representation. So you try to represent it, but what happens? You always fall short, right? You never manage to quite capture the truth of that. But Derrida doesn't want us to talk about the truth of this. He wants us to talk about instead the singularity of those moments. And those moments and the unique splendor and the ambiguity of those moments, the effervescence and the inability to fully describe those, is what is captured in writing, precisely because writing can't capture itself. It's always in this liminal state of almost bursting at the hinges. Think of a book that you read so much that the spine is literally starting to come apart, right? It is literally bursting at the hinges. This is the sort of radical alterity that texts have that is dissemination. He continues that if there is nothing outside the text, this implies, with the transformation of the concept of text in general, that the text is no longer the snug, airtight inside of an interiority or an identity to itself, but rather a different placement of the effects of opening and closing. Truth is, he says, the truth of fiction. Right? So there's an affirmation here of the fictive quality of writing, insofar as it creates a copy, right? Or it creates some kind of duplicate or artifact, which supposedly duplicates a truth which in fact it is dissimulating, which it is staging through the concatenation of marks, of signifiers. So it is always trying to bust itself open with the truth of what it refers to, but in so doing, all it does is signal its need for more texts, its need for us to read it again, to learn it better, to study it more closely, such that there is no text in general. There is no snug, airtight inside of the interiority or identity to itself. This would be the structuralist notion of the text, right? That the text is merely this ahistorical interiority. No, post-structuralists, in fact, are very willing to accept the historicity of texts because of the historicity of the text. The idea of the text is, in fact, a concept, an illusion that is created to allay the dissemination that texts do. Therefore, textuality is always indefinitely dispersed and fractured. He says you are reading a piece of writing here, and all this is producing itself in a text. right? So textuality is producing itself precisely by producing more signifiers. Therefore, it is always changing, always developing, always burgeoning and fracturing itself from the inside as we trace new lines of meaning. I think this is a really key statement that he says here about there not being an outside text. There is nothing but text. There is nothing but extra text. In sum, an unceasing preface that undoes the philosophical representation of the text, the received opposition between the text and what exceeds it. The space of dissemination does not merely place the plural in effervescence. It shakes up an endless contradiction, marked out by the undecidable syntax of more. And we see this endless contradiction staged in this very sentence, right? There is nothing but text. There is nothing but extra text. And he has extra text as one word here. What he's saying is that there is always texts that are being more than they claim to be. They are always undecidably more than they initially led on. Dispersing, degrading, fracturing. Some of these are good, some of these are bad, and really there's no a priori way to know if the way a text is changing is good or bad. I mean, how has Beowulf changed since it was written? How has our understanding of the very text, the very core of what it is, how has that changed historically, and is that good or bad? Well, Derrida is going to deny this idea that we can find some truth of Beowulf, either just from accounting for it empirically better or hermeneutically better, or speculatively better, philosophically better. In any of these ways that we attempt to arrest the text, all we get is more writings, more texts, more dissemination of signifiers, such that all we have is an unceasing preface, right? This ability to try to lay out our terms, to finally get to what we actually wanted to talk about, but we're sort of always stumbling over our terms. Think about how linguistics still does not have one meaning for language, precisely because they've realized the polysemy of this concept of language. In literary studies, textuality has come under a lot of critique, and we have a lot of critical schools that are very wary of the univocal idea of the text, post-structuralists being one of them. And this is why. Instead of having the opposition between the text, which is self-subsistent, which can be bracketed and treated in and of itself, and then history, politics, the world out there. Instead of that, what we have is a plurality in effervescence already attested to in the text, which harkens to a variety of historical moments. And we can't say how that hearkening will manifest in advance. This is why we cannot predict the trajectory of a text, nor can we tie it down. Next, we have Derrida's essay, Plato's Pharmacy, where he opens, "A text is not a text unless it hides from the first comer, from the first glance, the law of its composition and the rules of its game. A text remains, moreover, forever imperceptible. Its law and its rules are not, however, harbored in the inaccessibility of a secret. It is simply that they can never be booked in the present into anything that could rigorously be called a perception." What is he saying here? Well, he's saying that a book is never a discrete, logical, self-present entity. It is always constituted by wholes which would seem to hide some secret, but he wants to deny this idea of a secret because that has a sort of conservatism behind it. The idea that we just need to get back to the authentic meaning of the text. This is a sort of historicist fault where we merely try to reconstruct the original and that will supposedly authorize a hermeneutic approach to the text, right? It will sort of explain the text if we just can account for the original. But in fact, Derrida, quite the opposite, wants to show that texts are always belying the notion of originality and always speaking forth, hearkening to a new moment, not only in the sort of history of the textual artifact, but also in our ideas about it and in our readings of it. The fact that we continually have to come back and read the same text such that it can't really be called the same text anymore, right? So it hides from its first comer precisely because it always sort of seduces or coaxes us onwards, right? This first glance. He's talking about texts in a sort of seductive way. This is something very similar to Baudrillard. The dissimulation of the woven texture, he says, can in any case take centuries to undo its web. A web that envelops a web, undoing the web for centuries, reconstituting it too as an organism, indefinitely regenerating its own tissue behind the cutting trace, the decision of each reading. There is always a surprise in store for the anatomy or physiology of any criticism that might think it had mastered the game, surveyed all the threads at once, deluding itself, too, in wanting to look at the text without touching it, without laying a hand on the object, without risking, which is the only chance of entering into this game by getting a few fingers caught, the addition of some new thread. Adding here is nothing other than giving to read. I think this is an extremely powerful and relevant passage in Derrida's oeuvre. That dissimulation of this woven texture gives way to the dissemination of traces, which we follow and simultaneously create each time we decide to read. And this idea of the decision is really important for Derrida, because reading is properly political in its riskiness for Derrida. Each time we come to a text, we come to something that harkens to a bunch of moments which preceded it, and also harkens to the excess that the text has burgeoning within it precisely because it cannot remain a within, because it always burgeons, expands, belies any one interpretation, and always allows for us to come to it as unique readers, right? And we entertain a unique readerly moment where we decide to make decisions. We decide to sit down and read. We decide to follow certain interpretive avenues. In so doing, we are enveloped by a web which we create, which we dissimulate, and we supposedly reconstitute, when in actuality we are constituting anew and imperceptibly different each time. Therefore, he's speaking of the text as a living organism with an anatomy and physiology, which always surprises any critic who thinks that they can master this animal, right? So texts are properly animalistic for Derrida. All we do each time is add a thread which we suppose will solve this organism. So in Plato's Pharmacy, Derrida tries to weave a thread of mythologies and of fictions, and one of the ones that he focuses on is Egyptian mythology, and in particular, the god Thoth. And Thoth is the god of writing, also of magic and deception. He's sort of like Loki in the Norse tradition. And Thoth is really the emblem of the kind of other writing that he wants to enact here. He says, the figure of Thoth is opposed to its other, father, son, life, speech, origin, etc. Right? These are all things which supposedly authorize a truth, right? The father's truth, the son, which is worshipped in Egyptian religion, the life that is supposedly opposed to the death which the writing supposedly embodies. Instead, Thoth is opposed as that which at once supplants and supplements it. Thoth extends or opposes by repeating or replacing. By the same token, the figure of Thoth takes shape and takes its shape from the very thing it resists and substitutes for. But it thereby opposes itself, passes into its other, and this messenger god is truly a god of the absolute passage between opposites. If he had any identity, but he is precisely the god of non-identity, he would be that coincidentia oppositorum, that coincidence of opposites, to which we will soon have recourse again. In distinguishing himself from his opposite, Thoth also imitates it, becomes its sign and representative, obeys it and conforms to it, replaces it by violence if need be. He is thus the father's other, the father and the subversive movement of replacement. The god of writing is thus at once his father, his son, and himself. He cannot be assigned a fixed spot in the play of differences. Sly, slippery, and masked, an intriguer and a card, like Hermes, he is neither king nor jack, but rather a sort of joker, a floating signifier, a wild card, one who puts play into play. And this is a metaphor for writing as a whole that he's enacting here. Opposed to the authorities of speech, of the father and his signifier, of the origin which supposedly authorizes speech and authorizes the correct manuscript or the correct interpretation of a text. Instead, all we have is interpretations as supplements which supplant any one idea of origin or of truth, extending a series of oppositions through a signifying chain, repeating signifiers, but in so doing, replacing old ones with ones imperceptibly different. Therefore, it has an internal opposition, writing does, within itself, within this series of differences it creates in a textual field, and also the outside, which it tries to schematize. This is the non-identity which Thoth is the god of, and thereby Thoth uses imitation, becomes a sign and representative, obeys and conforms to what it actually subverts. And this is the very nature of postmodern writing. Think about pastiche, right? Pastiche is different from parody because parody is going to try to duplicate something, conform to something, in order to subvert it, precisely by poking fun at it, by negating that thing. But pastiche is different because pastiche is a sort of facile, face-like representation, an obeying of the norms that precisely show their impotence, because they are thereby replaced with a supplement which shows the duplicity, which shows the multiplicity of writing. It shows the iterability of the signifier, which inaugurates the idea of dissemination. It puts play into play. Therefore, textuality being constituted by differences and by differences from differences, Derrida says it is by nature absolutely heterogeneous and is constantly composing with the forces that tend to annihilate it. Very key passage here. Very short and pithy for Derrida's, for the types of things you'll get from Derrida, right? Textuality is differences all the way down. There is no absolute sameness in writing. Think of if you had a page, let's say it's 36 lines, and it's just the word dog over and over and over with a capital D, lowercase o, lowercase g, period. And it's just dog over and over and over and over. Well, you might say that this is the same word over and over. But Derrida wants to actually say that all we have is a bunch of different dogs, none of which are exactly identical to each other, right? Each one is a different mark. Even if it might supposedly refer to the same concept, Derrida says, well, the concept is really dissimulated here because we have this empty signifier that we can proliferate as much as we want. And all we have is the heterogeneity, right? The infinitesimalness and the infinity that is hearkened to with every signifier. The possibility that we could repeat it ad infinitum and we'd still have more signifiers. This shows the heterogeneity of every mark and therefore of every concept which the mark refers to. Because the ambiguity of marks invades the supposed univocality of signs and concepts for Derrida. So concepts are not immune in some ideal realm, but they are really embroiled in the conflict between signifiers, constantly composing with the forces that tend to annihilate it, right? Constantly trying to use difference to get rid of difference. And in so doing, all you do is simulate more difference. Finally, we have Derrida's essay, Dissemination. And he's looking at the work of Philippe Zollers, who writes this work on numbers. And he's really interested with this because it is sort of a hodgepodge of necessary engagement, which immediately annuls itself and lets itself be read at any point. And it is radically discontinuous, and it constantly speaks to a gap, which is enacted by this process of scission, la coupure, which he talks about. And the scission is a violent, arbitrary cut which one must make every time they make a reading decision. This can be literally anything. Anytime we stop on a particular word for longer than the others next to it, we cut the continuity of the text. We establish a unique moment of difference. Anytime we decide to pick up the book in a particular context, we cut the book off from some ideal context and cut it into a real-world context. Anytime we decide to literally cut out a page, we literally cut the artifact of the book and change it. We change our relationship to the meanings as well, because now that takes on a unique historical significance in time. So both literally and metaphorically, I'm talking about the actual reading experience. But Derrida wants to also talk in the purely philosophical way that we always have to make some incision, some decision when we approach writing. And yet it is, of course, this being both the text and the scission we use to incisively enter the text, is a beginning that is forever fictional. And the scission, far from being an inaugural act, is dictated by the absence of any decisive beginning, any pure event that would not divide and repeat itself and already refer back to some other beginning, some other event, the singularity of the event being more mythical than ever in the order of discourse. Scission is necessary because of the fact, or as a consequence of the fact, as you will, that the beginning is plied and multiplied about itself, elusive and divisive. It begins with its own division, its own numerousness. And this is really important. There is never an absolute inaugural signifier or an absolute inaugural moment whereby we can enter the text without any presuppositions, or without any biases, or without making a necessary decision, which is an act of scission, right, la coupure. So we must begin at some arbitrary point, which is nevertheless necessary. He says about the scission and the decision, the shot, throw, or blow parts the seed as it projects it. And he goes on to develop here a very elusive and very allegoric reading of this act of scission with that of insemination and dissemination. So he uses basically a sexual allegory here. It inscribes difference in the heart of life. It is that very difference which is the condition for their operation. No thing is complete in itself, and it can only be completed by what it lacks. But what each particular thing lacks is infinite. We cannot know in advance what complement it calls for. We can only, thus, recognize by the authority of fact and by our spirit's secret taste when the effective harmony, the essential generative mother difference had been found. A difference. The cause is radically that. It is not a positive difference, nor is it one included within the subject. It is what the subject is essentially lacking. Right, so this difference is something that the text never has. It's never something you can own. It's always something that the text is trying to stage. Try to authentically say, yes, I am a world all of my own. I have all the differences you need to understand me completely. You don't need the world. But in fact, Derrida wants to say that we do, and we constantly invoke that difference, and we constantly bring that in, and then push the text out of itself. Numerical multiplicity does not sneak up like a death threat upon a germ cell previously one with itself. As in, this text isn't something being threatened by an outside, but the text itself one. On the contrary, it serves as a pathbreaker for the seed, which therefore produces itself and advances only in the plural. It is a singular plural which no single origin will ever have preceded. Germination, dissemination. There is no first insemination. The semen is always swarming. The primal insemination is dissemination. A trace, a graft, whose traces have been lost, whether in the case of what is called language, discourse, text, etc., or in the case of some real seed sowing, each term is indeed a germ, and each germ a term. The term, the atomic element, engenders by division, grafting, proliferation. It is a seed and not an absolute term. But each germ is its own term, finds its term not outside itself, but within itself, as its own internal limit, making an angle with its own death. Right? So the text is always both allaying its death and depending upon its own death to allow for new reading moments. Every time we read a text, we're really killing the text that came before, killing the addition that came before, killing all the other interpretations that came before, and inaugurating in its place something which both testifies to and repeats those old ones, those old texts, and all the other texts that we use to talk about that text, and at the same time establishing a brand new one. A difference which is radically the cause of the text, which is a germ not outside the text, threatening to invade something which is previously one with itself. Instead, it is a insemination, right? Think of the inward, which is a disseminative capacity, always internal, always already there in the text, marking and making an angle with its own death, precisely by constantly germinating, by constantly, sexually or asexually, reproducing with itself. Therefore, he says, there is nothing prior to the group, no simple originary unit prior to this division through which life comes to see itself and the seed is multiplied from the start. Nothing comes before the addition in what the seed begins by taking itself away. Before what Solers' drama announced as a proliferation which would never have begun. Before what his logics set down as a swarm of bees, a division at work. Quote, language becomes that state of beginning, speaking up from all sides, whose soundless effects are immediately going to reverberate on that linguistic hinge or pivot, unquote. Derrida says, in what I think is a rather quotable moment. You are authorized to begin to do so by the law of the cut. It is henceforth prescribed that you clip out an example and dismember the text. And this is what Derrida does in this whole essay, is he constantly dismembers Solers' texts, and he's constantly pulling from them and using quotes, and in fact a significant amount of what I had quoted just a few minutes ago was a Solers quote. So what he wants us to do is be authorized to be authors of the dissemination of the text, of the meaning and of the fragmentation of the self-identity of the text, and therefore of the I, of the self, which supposedly authors the text. So we are always inactively deconstructing the supposedly originary, authorizing, authorial presence, which ensures the text's creation, which ensures its univocality. So we're always kind of speaking out of both sides of our mouth. On the one hand, we depend on the author, but on the other hand, we are realizing the theatrical nature of the author, the piecemeal creation of the author, which we are trying to fragment. He speaks of an I that is both part of the spectacle and part of the audience. An I that, a bit like you, attends its own incessant, violent reinscription within the arithmetical machinery. An I that, functioning as a pure passageway for operations of substitution, is not some singular and irreplaceable existence, some subject or life, but only moving between life and death, reality and fiction, a mere phantom or function. A term and a germ, a term that disseminates itself, a germ that carries its own term with it. Strengthening its breath with its death, the seed is sealed, the sperm firm. Brilliant, very beautiful passage here, where he's talking about this sort of germinative capacity of the self being testified to in the text. Both the authorial self and the readerly self and the textual self, all of these at once being fragmentarily created and staged and being deconstructed by us as the readers of the text, as the dissimulators and the disseminators of the text. Now, there's a lot more that Derrida talks about in this essay and in the whole book. He has a whole section at the very end talking about being and isness, which I think is very interesting. But I think that this is a pretty substantive lecture on its own, and I think anything else that I would add would be more helpful just to come from you reading the text. I think this is a really interesting and really incisive and insightful book, often meandering in Derrida's characteristic style, which I really enjoy. There were definitely parts of this I skipped, especially the Plato's Pharmacy one, just because I'm not well-versed enough in Plato to really be able to assess Derrida's work that he's doing on Plato on a philological and a philosophical level. But I really invite you to use what Derrida is saying here about dissemination when you approach other texts. I think it places the readerly presence as a very important political step in advancing the dissemination of texts, in the deconstruction of ideology and univocality. And I think it really places an active emphasis on reading as something that at once fits into and extricates systems, as one that can embody and tolerate systems and sameness and repetition, and also can inaugurate difference without needing some justifying authority other than the very act of writing and reading to do so. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting. You can check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me be able to purchase the books necessary to bring y'all content. It is not easy as a starving college student to have either the time or the money necessary to do this, but y'all certainly make it easy by constantly providing both monetarily and just in terms of your support and your viewership, so I thank you for that. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.